Richard had built a life that made him look like he had everything anyone could want. He had a luxurious office with shiny furniture, and he was always confident as he made big business deals and told his employees what to do. People admired him and thought he was a successful entrepreneur, someone who had everything, wealth, status, and a bright future. From the outside, Richard's life looked perfect. He had all the power and prestige that many people dreamed of. But behind the shiny surface, things weren't so perfect. Richard didn't really care about his wife Claire anymore. They had been married for over 15 years, and in the beginning, Claire was his biggest supporter. She believed in him when things were hard, helped him with his work, and always stood by his side. Claire made sure their home was always in order, and she took care of their everyday life. They had dreams together, and during the tough years, they shared laughs and faced challenges as a team. To the outside world, they seemed like the perfect couple, a husband and wife who could take on anything. But as Richard became more successful in his career, his thoughts about Claire started to change. Claire was still the same kind, simple woman who had supported him. But Richard didn't see her the same way anymore. He felt that her quiet and humble personality didn't match the image of success he was trying to build. To him, she no longer fit the glamorous life he was now living. She didn't have the right appearance to attend the high-profile corporate events that Richard now enjoyed. He began to think of her as a hindrance to his image, someone who wasn't impressive enough to be by his side at fancy dinners or business meetings. This was when Lily entered the picture. Lily was a complete opposite of Claire. She was young, beautiful, and full of confidence. Lily loved attention, and she was always dressed in the latest fashion. She loved the luxurious lifestyle that Richard now had, and she thrived in social situations where all eyes were on her. Richard immediately saw Lily as the perfect companion for business events. He began bringing her along to important meetings, dinners, and social gatherings. To everyone around him, Lily was his partner, and he was proud to show her off. Richard thought she was the perfect woman to help him climb even higher in the business world. He started spending more and more time with Lily, seeing her as a way to boost his own status. To him, Claire was now just a shadow in his life. She was at home, trusting him completely, while he was busy with Lily, playing the part of a perfect businessman. He believed he had everything under control and that Claire would never find out about his affair. But what Richard didn't know was that Claire was not as clueless as he thought. She had noticed his strange behavior, his frequent late-night business dinners, unexpected trips, and the weak excuses he gave for his absences. Claire began to sense that something wasn't right, and while she didn't have all the details, she had begun to realize that Richard was not being honest with her. However, she wasn't ready to confront him yet. She watched and waited, knowing that something would eventually give him away. One day, Richard was presented with the opportunity of a lifetime. He was invited to an exclusive meeting with foreign investors. This wasn't just any business deal. This was a chance to secure millions of dollars for his company and take it to the next level. Richard knew that this deal was crucial, and he believed that sealing it would require more than just his business skills. The investors needed to be impressed. They needed to see the right image, the right kind of person by his side, someone who would help convince them that Richard was the right man to work with. For a brief moment, Richard thought about bringing Claire along to the meeting, but the idea quickly disappeared from his mind. He couldn't risk bringing Claire, not when he needed someone who would shine in front of the investors. He didn't believe she had the right presence to impress them. Claire was still the same kind, quiet woman she had always been, but she wasn't the glamorous figure Richard thought he needed. Instead, he decided that Lily would be the perfect choice. She was everything Claire wasn't, youthful, captivating, and full of confidence. Richard was sure that Lily's presence would make all the difference in securing the deal. So, Richard made plans for the trip. He booked the tickets, arranged everything for Lily to come with him, and began preparing for the meeting. He couldn't let Claire know about the trip, though. He had to be careful. If Claire found out, everything would fall apart. He couldn't risk her discovering the truth, so he made up a story. That evening, Richard sat down for dinner with Claire, ready to start his plan. As usual, Claire smiled at him lovingly as she served the meal. Richard, trying to act casually, said, "Love, remember that important meeting I mentioned? It's been scheduled. I'll need to travel later this week, just for a couple of days. It's a very important meeting and I have to go." Claire, as always, was understanding and supportive. "Of course, dear," she replied, her eyes full of trust. "I know how much this means to you. If you need help packing, just let me know." Richard smiled to himself, pleased that everything was going according to plan. "Oh, don't worry," he said lightly. "I won't need any help with that. I'll just travel light. It's going to be a quick trip, just to close the contract. It's a huge opportunity, and I'm sure it will open doors for the company." Richard spoke with so much confidence, and Claire believed every word. He knew she trusted him completely and never suspected that he had any other intentions. The next day, Richard called Lily to confirm the details of the trip. "The meeting with the investors is set. I want you with me. Your presence will make all the difference, and we'll impress them for sure." Lily, eager to play her part, agreed, and Richard felt confident that everything was under control. He could already picture the scene in his head. The investors nodding in approval, Lily by his side, and the contract being signed. Everything was falling into place. The day of the trip arrived. Richard, full of confidence, met Lily at the airport. She was dressed in a stunning, elegant dress that made her stand out in the crowd. Richard couldn't have asked for a better companion. He felt that with Lily by his side, the investors would be impressed, and the deal would be his. They flew to Buenos Aires and headed straight to a luxurious hotel where the meeting would take place. The conference room was beautiful, with polished wooden furniture, large windows offering an amazing view of the city, and modern artwork on the walls. As they entered the room, Richard felt a sense of superiority. He walked past the receptionist without a second glance, sure of himself. He and Lily took their seats at the table, and the investors, 3 in total, looked at them closely. Richard introduced Lily as his wife, proud of how she looked. But the female investor, a woman with dark sunglasses, didn't seem impressed. She raised an eyebrow, sizing up Lily, and Richard didn't understand why she acted that way. But he brushed it off and went on with the presentation. As Richard spoke about his company's future and how the contract would help them grow, he couldn't shake the feeling that the female investor wasn't focused on the numbers. Instead, she seemed to be watching him and Lily very carefully. Richard didn't like it, but he pushed his discomfort aside. He was determined to get the deal. But as the meeting continued, the female investor began asking harder questions. She asked about the changes Richard's company planned to make, about how they would handle any problems with the new ideas. Her tone was challenging, and Richard started to feel nervous. Despite his confidence, he couldn't ignore the strange feeling that something wasn't right. He pressed on with his presentation, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the female investor. There was something about her that made him feel uneasy. She seemed so familiar, yet Richard couldn't figure out why. He tried to shake the feeling, but deep down, he knew things weren't as simple as he thought. The female investor wasn't impressed by his pitch, and her sharp questions made Richard uncomfortable. He realized too late that the meeting wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. Meanwhile, back at home, Claire had been watching and waiting. She knew something wasn't right, and soon she would have the answers. Richard was nervous. He didn't expect his uncertainty to show, but he quickly tried to cover it up by smiling. "Of course," he said, trying to sound confident. "We're committed to being open with all our partners, and we'll address any concerns." But inside, something didn't feel right. The conversation was getting more complicated, and Lily, who he thought would help him, wasn't as supportive as he had hoped. He began to wonder if bringing her along had been a good idea. The female investor, who had been quiet up until then, looked at him carefully. The air in the room felt tense. Richard realized that he might not be able to handle this situation with just his charm. He had underestimated the people in the room. The female investor, who still hadn't spoken, finally leaned forward and took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were sharp and focused. She spoke to Richard in perfect French. Richard, charm isn't enough to get this partnership. You need to show real commitment, or we won't be satisfied. Richard's heart raced. He struggled to keep calm and smiled again, but it wasn't easy. Of course, madam, I understand, he said, but he didn't feel sure. He started to realize that this woman wasn't someone he could fool with a smile. She knew more than he thought. The investor kept asking tough questions. She asked Richard about his company's plans for managing the changes that were happening inside the company. Richard had not prepared for questions about the management. He tried to answer, but his mind was racing. Yes, we're adjusting the team to make sure things go smoothly. We have trained professionals to handle it, he said quickly. The woman smiled slightly, like she knew he wasn't being completely honest. She asked again, this time about the company's new chief financial officer, CFO, who had recently made big changes. Richard was shocked. He hadn't expected her to know about these recent changes, especially because he didn't know much about them himself. He had people working on it, but now he felt exposed. Yes, we're aligning everything, he said, but he felt like he wasn't convincing her. Lily, who was standing next to him, looked worried. She knew something was wrong. Richard's smile started to fade, and the tension in the room grew. The makeup that had been hiding her true identity. To Richard's shock, the woman was none other than his wife, Claire. Surprise, Richard? Claire said calmly. Richard couldn't believe what he was seeing. He was stunned and confused. Claire, what are you doing here? He stammered. Claire, now looking completely different, didn't react to his shock. She spoke firmly. I'm one of the main investors in your company, Richard. While you were busy pretending and betraying me, I was building my own empire. I knew everything, every move you made, every meeting. Now, I own a big part of your company. Richard felt like he had been punched. His heart raced as he tried to understand what was happening. No, this can't be true. You, how? He whispered, still in shock. Claire smiled. Yes, Richard. While you were too busy with your secrets, I was quietly buying shares and becoming an important part of your business. Now I have control. The other investors in the room watched silently. Richard was exposed and his confidence shattered. He tried to stay calm, but failed. Why, Claire? Why would you do this? We're married, he asked, feeling desperate. Claire's face didn't show any emotion. Married? You forgot that, didn't you? You betrayed me over and over, and I watched you. You treated me like nothing. But now, I'm the one in control. Richard felt the weight of her words. His whole world was falling apart. His wife, whom he had always underestimated, was the one who had the power all along. He felt helpless. Lily, who had been standing next to Richard, was now looking confused. She didn't know what to say. Richard tried to find his voice but couldn't. His world was collapsing suddenly. The investor leaned forward again, but this time, she slowly took off her wig. As the wig came off, Richard saw her dark, wavy hair. Then she took off her glasses and wiped her face clean of. Claire wasn't finished. It wasn't hard to find out what you were doing. From the beginning, I knew. Every lie you told, every excuse, I saw it. But I didn't confront you. I waited. And while you thought you were winning, I was carefully building my own future. Richard could barely breathe. He had always thought he was a genius behind the company. But now he realized it was Claire who had been guiding everything all along. He had no control, and everything he built was slipping away. I don't want to destroy the company, Richard, Claire said, but you were just a face. You were never really in control. I was the one who worked hard to make sure the company thrived. And now, I'm in charge. Richard felt defeated. You can't do this, he begged, his voice trembling. I'm the CEO. I built this. Claire looked at him coldly. No, Richard. You were too busy playing games while I worked. Now, everything is mine and well, you'll have to deal with the consequences. The silence in the room was deafening. Richard sat down, feeling like everything he had worked for was falling apart. Claire had planned it all. He had never imagined she would do something like this, but now it was clear. His arrogance had blinded him to the truth. The investors were staring at him. Claire had won. She had outsmarted him, and he was left with nothing. Richard was sitting in a meeting room, feeling confident. He thought everything was under control, but what happened next shattered everything he believed in. He had worked so hard to build his company, and now it seemed like the people around him were ready to take it all away. "You're no longer needed here." Claire's words hit Richard like a cold slap. She was calm, cool, and completely in control. "The company doesn't need you. I can handle everything on my own now." Richard looked to Lily, his lover and confidant, hoping for some support, but she wasn't looking at him. She seemed lost, realizing she had been caught up in something far bigger than she could have imagined. Lily avoided his gaze, unsure of how to react. She probably knew it was no longer her place to say anything. Richard felt utterly alone in that moment, but his realization was too late. The silence in the room was unbearable. He was defeated. He had lost the respect of everyone in the room. He had lost trust, and worst of all, he had lost the very company he had spent his life building. Claire stood, confidently addressing the other investors, her posture firm. She was the new leader now. "Now that we've cleared up any confusion," Claire began, "we can discuss the partnership details." She paused, glancing at the investors who were already nodding, recognizing Claire as the true leader in the room. Richard didn't know what to do. He was no longer the man in charge, and he knew it. He lowered his head in defeat, feeling completely humiliated. He had built an empire, but now it seemed like everything was crumbling around him. Claire turned to Richard, locking eyes with him as if to show she had completely taken over. "As for the company, Richard," she said with calm authority, "I have some decisions to make. These decisions will impact both the future of the business and our personal relationship. You will know my decision soon enough." There was a slight pause before she added, "I'm not going to resolve everything here and now." Her words were sharp, and there was an unmistakable coolness in her tone. Richard opened his mouth, trying to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. His throat was dry, and he realized that it would be pointless. No one was listening to him anymore. Claire had played her cards perfectly. Richard had underestimated her, thinking she was just a silent partner. But she had been quietly building her power. Lily, seeing the shift, began to feel the weight of the situation. She realized that she no longer belonged in this room. She glanced at Richard one last time, but he didn't even notice her. She saw him for what he was now, a broken man. The confident leader she had been involved with was gone, replaced by someone who couldn't even stand up for himself. Without a word, Lily rose from her seat. She walked quickly toward the door, slipping out of the room quietly. No one paid her any attention. Richard was lost in his own thoughts, and Claire was too focused on the bigger picture to care about Lily. It was clear that Lily's presence was no longer needed, and she was about to be forgotten. Claire, who had successfully taken control of the situation, didn't even spare Lily a second thought. She was far more interested in the future of the business. She was in charge now, and she planned to make it a success. She turned to the investors, flashing a small, confident smile. "Thank you for your patience," she said. "We'll be in touch soon to discuss the next steps. We all want to see this company thrive under new leadership." The door closed behind Claire as she left the meeting room, leaving Richard alone. The meeting that was supposed to be a moment of triumph for him had become his greatest defeat. He sat there trembling, his hands resting on the table, unsure of what to do next. The world he had known was slipping away, and he couldn't do anything to stop it. Claire's final words echoed in his mind. "Take this time to reflect on your mistakes." Those words felt like a heavy weight on his chest. She was now in charge of both his career and his personal life. His once unshakable confidence had crumbled, and all that was left was a deep sense of regret. The silence around him was deafening, and he realized that the company, his future, and everything he had worked for were no longer his to control. Richard sat in his apartment later that night, staring at the empty bottles on the table. The luxurious world he had once lived in felt so distant now. He was no longer the man in charge, the man who gave orders. The realization hit him harder with every passing second. His phone was silent, and he felt the heavy weight of loneliness. Claire's voice echoed in his mind, repeating the words she had said. "You'll know my decision soon." He couldn't escape them. The next few days were a blur for Richard. His life, which once felt full of possibilities, now felt empty. He received the official notice. His hand shook as he read it. The meaning of the words was hard to process. Claire had filed a lawsuit months ago, and now the court had decided in her favor. She had gained control over the company, something Richard had never expected. He thought he had all the power, but Claire had quietly outmaneuvered him. The court's decision was swift and final, and Richard realized he had lost everything. Claire had also fired Lily. In a cold, impersonal email, she let Lily know her services were no longer needed. Lily, who had once been Richard's confidant and lover, was discarded without a second thought. She didn't fight it. She didn't even call Richard. She packed up her things and left. As the days passed, Richard felt more and more isolated. His apartment, once filled with luxury and laughter, was now cold and empty. He had lost his job, his wealth, and his reputation. Every time he checked the news, he saw another story about Claire's growing success. She was restructuring the company, signing contracts Richard had only dreamed of. She was making millions while he was left with nothing. Claire's quiet strength had turned her into the woman Richard had underestimated. She was the one who had outsmarted him, outplayed him, and taken everything he once held dear. She had turned the company into an empire. Richard could only watch from the outside, disconnected from the life he had once known. One day, as he walked through the city, he passed by the company's headquarters. The building now had Claire's name on it. Richard stared at it, feeling a sharp pain in his chest. The company he had built was now hers. He had worked so hard, but now he was just a forgotten chapter in the company's story. Richard realized the full extent of his mistakes. He had been blinded by pride, and now he was left with nothing. Claire had used his arrogance against him, and now she was the one who held all the power. The weight of his downfall pressed down on him, and for the first time, Richard truly understood the consequences of underestimating others. His story was a costly lesson, one he would never forget. If this story made you think or gave you a new perspective, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss our future videos. Let's keep sharing thought-provoking stories and learning from life's lessons together. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.